Hello, everyone. I hope your day's going okay so far. Welcome to Content Design Uncovered. I'm Rachel, a content designer at Co-op. I think I've officially been a content designer for about 18 months now, but I've worked in many other content roles for the last 20 years. And I'd say that content design is a relatively new job role. It's only really started to get noticed in the last 5 years, or I may have done it sooner. Like many content designers, I've trodden quite a familiar path. As you can see, there are many different job roles there. They've all prepared me in some way for being a content designer, and I've loved them all for very different reasons. Maybe apart from being an estate agent, might forget that one. I believe content should never be an afterthought. It's that important. And throughout my career, I've always put the audience first, and content design does that too, which is why I'm so passionate about it.
Hello, I'm Molly. I also work at Co-op. I'm a lead content designer there. I've been working with content for about 12 years. Before that, I was always interested in writing anyway, but specifically I've been working with content for the last 12 years or so. My path to becoming a content designer wasn't quite as convoluted as Rachel's, but I have worked my way through various different job roles to get here. So I started out wanting to be, straight out of uni, wanted to be a journalist, specifically a music journalist. And I used to freelance for quite a few different publications during that time. From there, I got a job with the Manchester Evening News, so specialising obviously in writing for print there. From there, I moved into PR, where I was a copywriter for quite a few years. That involved combining writing for digital with writing for print. And I slowly began to realise that digital was more the area that I wanted to work in. I found that more and more of my job role was about content designing rather than copywriting. And eventually I moved to Co-op in March, where I became March last year, I should say, sorry, where I became like a pure play content designer for the first time. And I've been fortunate enough to have been promoted to lead content designer since then. And I think one thing worth mentioning at this point, as you can see from Rachel's career path and also my slightly less complicated but still quite meandering career path, is that with content design being quite a new discipline, quite a lot of people follow quite an unconventional path into content design and will quite often come to it from backgrounds that you might not necessarily associate with content. So, for example, within our content design team at Co-op, we have 2 content designers who actually started out working in Co-op stores. And they originally joined us to act as what we call subject matter experts and to give us an insight into how stores work and the kind of things that store colleagues need. And from there, they've actually joined us as permanent content designers. So I know there'll be a lot of people watching today who perhaps haven't worked in content before, haven't worked in digital before. And I just thought it was worth saying that it can still very much be for you, even if it's not an area you've worked in before.
So, what is content design? Before we explain, I think it's worth saying that creating good content certainly isn't easy. It takes a lot of hard work and effort, dedication, collaboration, to create simple content that everyone understands. And if you have worked in a content role, you will be familiar with other people thinking that they can do your job better than you can. Just because everyone can write emails, blogs, blog posts, Word docs. So you do have that problem occasionally. Now, this is a quote from Christina Halverson, who's a well-known content strategist. You should look her up on Twitter. So she says, dealing with content is messy, it's complicated, it's painful, and it's expensive. And yet the web is content. Content is the web. It deserves our time and attention. This is a really interesting quote for me, because really when you think about it, what would a web page actually look like without content? There'd be nothing there. It'd be totally blank. Maybe with a few well-designed boxes. So that's how important content is. And Christina goes on to say, do you think it's a coincidence that web content for the most part is crap? People don't give it the time and attention it deserves because it's hard to do. So if we want to create a good and useful product, service, thing, that could be a marketing email, blog post, we can only do it by creating good content. And this is another quote from another person you should really look up. Sarah Richards is considered the mother of content design. She's been a massive influence in developing the discipline today. And she describes content design so well and succinctly that I'm stealing her quote. So content design is a way of thinking. It's about using data and evidence to give the audience what they need at the time they need it and in a way they expect. And this is the real difference between content design and other content roles. You know, with evidence, you're responding to what you're seeing and hearing from your audience or your users, as they're called in digital. And you use data, things like Google Analytics, for example, to inform your content. And this is a real misconception, the next slide, because content design isn't at all just about writing words. Content doesn't mean just mean words or copy, as we call it. You could be thinking about using a map, a calculator, an infographic, an image, a video, a link. All these things are classed as content, and it's your job as a content designer, along with others, to decide what that content is. So in a nutshell, content designers make information easy to find, simple to understand, and accessible to everyone. And accessibility is so important. It's really the foundation of everything, because you want everyone to understand your content, whether they have a cognitive or mobility impairment, whether they speak English as a second language. So accessibility is so important.
So Rachel's explained a little bit there about what content design is, but I'm just going to talk a little bit now about why content design is important, which Rachel's touched on a little bit, but just to delve into that a bit more. So content design is especially important in the digital world because people read online content totally different to the way that they read printed content. So if you think about the way that you interact with your smartphone on a daily basis, you know, the scrolling, the scan reading, it's very different to how you would read, for example, a newspaper article. And we need to think about that when we're designing digital content. You really can't assume that everybody is going to go to your web page or your app or read your marketing email word for word. They're not going to do that. We know that digital readers, they skip over content, they scan for the content that's relevant for them, and you always need to bear that in mind. You also need to consider that there are a lot of factors that might affect how someone interacts with your content. So there's a huge range of these, but just to summarize some of the key ones, your user might be someone who has low literacy and struggles to read. They might have a disability that means that interacting with your page or with your product is really challenging for them and makes some of the content really difficult to absorb or even to access at all. English might not be their first language. And then there's more situational stuff, like they might be just having a bad day. They might be stressed. They might have a dodgy internet connection. They might have a toddler pulling on their arm while they're trying to read what you've written. All of these things mean that they're going to absorb your content differently. And speaking a little bit more widely outside of the digital world, good content is important everywhere, really, because when stuff's not clear, users get frustrated. We've all encountered this, and there's a couple of examples here, bad examples, of where perhaps we rely on people's understanding or things that are implied rather than spelling things out for them. So all the labels that you get in your clothes that with these funny symbols, none of us seem to know what they mean. And here, obviously, there's an explanation as to what they mean. But in the context of looking at the label, we don't get those explanations. So that can be frustrating. There's a little example here of an error state, which is really not useful to you if you want to know what to do because of the error. Good content saves companies money. So as you might expect, I've used an example for Co-op here. This is a little screenshot of our How Do I website. This is something that we worked on. It's a colleague-facing service, and what it's for is to help our food colleagues to do the tasks associated with their job just really quickly and easily, get the information that they need to get on with that task. So the content was all organised to reflect the way that our colleagues think and how they look for information, and it's had a massive impact. People are able to go about their working day more easily, and we're getting 1,000 fewer calls to the colleague helpline a week. And apparently, I'm not a money person, but apparently that equates to £500,000 saved by Co-op so far. So content really can save a huge amount of money. Bad content can get you in trouble. The example at the bottom here is for the Health Research Authority, which is an organisation in America. And a judge deemed that the content on their website was ambiguous and potentially misleading, which got them in a ton of trouble. And then a slightly more silly, but still relevant example at the top there, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs obviously hadn't been auditing their links and ended up sending their users somewhere that they definitely didn't want to be sending them. And finally, good content saves lives. So I would say this, obviously I think my job is really important, and it might sound a touch dramatic, but it really is true. The top examples here of poor road signage and also of a badly written letter to people with cancer symptoms. When you don't think about how you present this content, it really can cause damage and be dangerous to people. And as you can see at the bottom here, a very recent example of some not great content design. Obviously, when everything with coronavirus was first starting and we were all getting used to the new way of things, none of us knew what social distancing meant. It's become part of our parlance now. We're all very, very familiar. But when the term was first getting used, it wasn't something we were familiar with, yet it was something that the government was saying over and over again. What would have been clearer would have been the example in the green on the right, which gave you specific actions that you needed to take out rather than this vague term that didn't have any meaning attached to it for many people. And obviously in that case, following the government guidelines and staying at home, getting groceries once a week really did save lives. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what content designers do. So you've probably already picked this up. But the point of our job is making things clearer for people. And we do this by using short sentences that are easy to read. We use subheaded sections so that when you're talking about a page that's quite content heavy, it's really easy to scan read so that users can find the information that is relevant to them as quickly as possible. And we also use the simplest possible vocabulary, and that is regardless of the audience that we're writing for. Sometimes when content designers work, they might get accused of dumbing down content, and that is a term that does get used sometimes, especially when we're writing for what's deemed to be an expert audience who apparently will understand all of the expert terms and the jargon. But what research has actually found is that these so-called experts actually prefer simple vocabulary because it helps them to digest the content easier. So simple vocabulary for everyone, regardless of audience. We don't get precious about using terms that the business uses, and we certainly don't use words to try and sound more informed or more clever. So we focus on the terms that users use. So you won't often hear somebody saying, I'm going to call the National Facilities Operations Centre. They're more likely to say they're going to call facilities. So that's the term that we would also use. Retail premises, that's just a fancy word for stores. So we would use stores. And terms like under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. When you're including terms like that, you really need to think about, well, hang on, does the person reading this content really care about the name of the legislation that I'm discussing? Or do they actually just care that I'm asking them to do something by law? So content designers take big, impenetrable content like this that is hard to read, and they make it look something more like this. They strip it back to its essentials and to make it clearer and easier to digest.
So thanks, Molly. Molly described there how content designers take existing content to improve it. But when you're designing content from scratch, there's a process that we as content designers follow. And the first thing we do is research. So this really sets content design apart from other roles in content. Usually, if you work in a product team, you would have a user researcher on your team, but often content designers get involved in research too. In fact, the whole of a product team gets involved in research. There are loads of different research methods and ways to gather research. There's desk research, so you could just get your Mac or PC out. You could go to Google Trends, chat rooms, other websites. There's also usability research, like interviews with your audience and surveys, and they're just a few methods. And from that research, you'll develop user needs. So this is about, what is your audience or user's goal? What do they want to do? What are they trying to achieve? And that might be buy a table or find out how to have a COVID test. So many things people want to find out online. And ultimately, your content needs to help that person achieve their goal. So good content, again, in other content roles, you might base decisions on what you personally think or what your stakeholders are telling you to do, rather than what your audience needs. That means you don't always give the audience what they need, as this image shows. And it's really important you think the user's way, the audience's way. You don't force your audience to think your way, because they'll find their own path, as you can see there, and they'll bypass your way. And then next we move on to channel and journey mapping. So we as content designers with other people in our product teams work out which channels are the right ones to get the messages across at a particular point in the journey. And this normally involves lots of post-its on walls when we're in a physical space. So this is an example. And obviously we can't do that at the moment. So we're using an online collaboration tool called Miro to map out these journeys. And usually you work together, sometimes with the whole of your product team, on mapping out the journey your audience uses to get to your content, what they do when they're there, and what they do afterwards. And it's so important to understand that end-to-end journey, even if you're not responsible for the content that comes before and after. That's because it'll help you understand what your audience needs at the time they need it, and it'll bring consistency to the whole journey. So if you tell them things before you need to and overwhelm them, or don't tell them what they need at a certain point in the journey, that journey could end for them and they'll give up on your content. So it really can be the difference between success and failure. And the next part of the process is language and emotion. So one of my favourite bits, really delving into the language your audience uses, as Molly mentioned before. Again, you do this through research. So you might listen into calls to the customer service centre, for example, to understand how your clients, colleagues and customers are saying things and how they're saying things. You might go into social media or into chat rooms and places where your audience are, and you might listen to interviews with your audience. And then the emotional side of it, we as content designers really try to understand what someone might be feeling when they're interacting with our content. And that's about putting yourself in your audience's shoes, which requires real empathy and understanding. And then we finally move on to the creation. So there's so many steps before you get to this point. And unlike other maybe content roles, you don't just toddle off into a room and get your Mac out or PC and start creating content. You don't work on your own. You work with interaction designers, service designers, researchers, product owners, stakeholders, and they aren't all in digital roles. And then sharing is so important. You actively seek feedback from your team, from other content designers, from your audience, from stakeholders. And I suppose I was quite used to this in the other content roles I had, you know, people editing your work, people looking at your work. But content crits are a bit different, because when we're all together in a physical space normally, there's quite a lot of us in a group, and you're presenting your content and people are commenting on it. And that can be quite daunting, but it's so valuable. And it's a safe space where no one criticizes, everyone just gives you valuable feedback, because no one gets everything right first time. And then finally, iteration. You'll hear this word used a lot in digital. Testing and learning. So that means changing all the time. And this process never stops. You're always getting feedback, data, research, and that's informing changes to your content.
I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the skills and qualities that you need to be a content designer. So as you can see at the bottom here in bigger letters than all the other qualities are solid writing skills. So it's probably something you already knew, but even though writing content isn't the only part of being a content designer, it is really important to have that solid foundation of having good spelling, grammar and punctuation and a good grasp of language, just so that when it does come to writing that content, you can do it in the best possible way. As Rachel touched on just now, empathy and understanding is incredibly important. You need to be interested in people. You need to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes, and that's a really important quality for content designers to have. You need to be good with data and evidence. So we're getting feedback all the time on how products and services are performing. We need to be able to look at that data, interpret it in the right way, and figure out what that means for how the content's working for the product and whether we need to change it. You need to have a logical mind, so you can plan and figure out the best way to approach work. You need to be a great communicator, so you can get your ideas across and really be a champion of good content. With content design being quite a new discipline, it's often quite a new thing in organisations, and we spend an awful lot of time sort of championing content design, and it's really important that we're able to speak confidently about it. You need to be a problem solver. So a key part of our job's finding the best content solution, which is very, very often not the most obvious solution. And it might sometimes also not be what the business had originally envisioned you would do. So each piece of work brings its own unique problems, and you really need to be able to approach each task with fresh eyes and a fresh approach. You really do need to be a great collaborator. So as Rachel talked about before, we work very, very closely with the entire team, but particularly with the designers and the researchers. And you need to be really good at working well with those people and sharing your work. You need to be comfortable and always able to put your audience first, and that sometimes means a degree of stakeholder management and making sure that although business needs are obviously very important, those user needs that Rachel talked about before should always be at the forefront of what you do, and they should always be the main driver behind the work. And you need to be good with people. So a lot of these qualities are on a similar theme of being interested in people and being good with people, but talking to people and understanding where they're coming from, whether that's your user or one of your stakeholders, is really important. And so you need to be a good listener and able to take on board what people are saying to you. We also recommend getting yourself a clever wordplay mug, always a hit around the office, and sets your stall out nice and early in your team about what you're all about.
So what's it like to work at Coop Digital? So our mission is to create coherent products and services that provide community benefit and commercial return for Co-op. So we have a growing number of content designers. I think about 5 years ago, there were 3, and now there are 14. So it's become a really valued role in Co-op. we all work in these different product teams, and usually you'll be the only content designer on a multidisciplinary team. So you will usually be the only one. But we have a content community of practice, which is an incredibly supportive group of people, not just content designers, people from other content roles across the business. And we come together regularly as content people to learn from each other and support each other. And we do love sticking things on walls when we're actually in the office, as you can see. We also do a lot of user research, as I mentioned before, speaking to real customers and colleagues and clients to understand their motivations and their needs. We also make sense of the problem we're trying to solve through service maps, working closely with all sorts of stakeholders across Co-op. And finally, there's no real typical day, and I think Molly will agree with me here, but you might find us doing a number of these things. You might find us with our post-its, more post-its, in a sketching session with other designers, writing service emails, creating service and journey maps, listening into user testing, all sorts of stuff.
So if all of that has piqued your interest, and we hoped it has, we did just have a few pieces of recommended reading if you want to find out a little bit more about content design. First on the list is the content design book by Sarah Richards. As Rachel mentioned before, Sarah is very much considered to be the mother of content design, and this book is essentially like a content design handbook that all of us keep on their desks. I can literally see my copy right now, and it's a really succinct, really useful summary of like the content design process. So that's a really great starting point if you're wanting to learn a bit more. If you're looking for a little bit more detail, there's Letting Go of the Words and also Don't Make Me Think, which look a little bit more into writing for the web. Both of those books are a couple of years old now, but everything in them is still very much relevant to content design and writing for the web. And then the last book on the list here, Writing is Designing, that's a more recent publication that very much sort of explores the methods you can use to create usable content and thinking about creating content not as just writing words on the page, but viewing it very much as a design process, which is what content design is. And that's our talk for today. Thank you all for joining. You can follow Rachel and myself on Twitter. Our handles are here. And thank you very much. Hope it was useful.